Hello, it's Jennifer from Sea Lemon. Lately I've been doing a lot of chain stitch bookbinding and I wanted to explore more one-section binding methods, meaning there's just one row of binding on a group of pages. So I decided to compile all of the binding methods that I learned into one big video, and in this video you will find 8 of these stitches and methods to try. These kind of bindings are great to start with if you are a beginner at bookbinding and they require minimal materials, no glue. I did make individual square back notebooks to try these methods on, but you could definitely practice these on scrap paper or apply these to any of your book projects of choice. Since this is a long one, I did include the time codes in the description in case you want to jump between how I made the covers of the notebooks, and if you don't, you could just skip right to the different binding methods. I also want to give credit to this book by Keith Smith. It helped me a lot on figuring out the different names for these binding methods and how to do them. And if you're curious on this, I will put the link down below. It's a great resource if you're really into bookbinding. And with that, I also want to say there are so many different variations on how to bind a book. So just because this has one way in it doesn't mean that that's the only way to bind. So I highly recommend experimenting and trying your own variations of these, and maybe these will spark some ideas. So let's get into it. In case you want to know how I set up my books, here is what I used for all 8 bindings. 6 letter size sheets for the inside pages. The weight is totally up to you. And for the cover, I'm using this double-sided cardstock. I didn't show it here, but the other side of this has craft paper. And cut in half, this paper will give me 2 books. I measured 4 inches from each side and scored a line to give a spine with a square back. So down the middle of the cardstock is a 1/2 inch wide scored spine. Now with all the paper stacked together, I'm cutting it in half on the short width to make 2 books. Now folding over the score lines to make that square back. And then I folded over the whole stack of pages since the paper is on the thin side and there isn't much of it, so I could just fold over the whole thing. You can, of course, fold each sheet in half individually if you prefer. Then lay everything flat together, and you can use binder clips to hold all pages together, or you can also use paper clips if you don't have any on hand. And now I'm going to measure out the binding holes. Using a ruler and an awl, and if you don't have an awl, you can also use a thumbtack. To keep this simple, I made mine a 1/2 inch apart, but you can make any measurement you want for your book. Going back in with the awl to make sure there's enough room for the binding needle to fit through. Then on my craft thread, I'm going to run it across beeswax, and this will coat it and make it easier to bind with so it tangles less, but this is optional and you can also buy thread that is already waxed. Single thread a binding needle, and now I'm going to show you a very common popular stitch to start with. A saddle stitch binding is very common in the print world, and it's very similar to variations of a pamphlet or a figure-8 bookbinding stitch. I did make a tutorial on this years ago, but I thought it made sense to include it in this video since it is a single section binding. Starting from the middle is very common for any pamphlets or booklets, and that's what I'm used to, but honestly you can start at any part of the spine, on any hole. Leave a tail of thread on the inside or the outside if you like your knot to be on the outside of your book, and return the needle back through the next hole. And repeat that through to the next holes. When you reach the head or tail of your book, you can return the needle back through to the previous holes. This time it's kind of sewing in the opposite direction, but you're still doing that same motion, and this is where it kind of looks like a figure-8 motion. And while you're sewing around the thread that's already there, make sure you don't go through it. So you want to either point the needle above the thread or below the thread, just so that you don't sew through it. Otherwise the thread gets really weird and knotted, and yeah, it's not fun. If you started from the middle like me, when you get to the other end of your head or tail of your book, you can do the same thing and just return to the middle. You want to return to that tail you left so you can use that to tie a knot. And after I tie a knot, I like to tuck in the ends and trim off any excess thread to keep it all neat. Remove the binding clips and readjust the outside cover if you also made a square back. And if you're new to bookbinding, I think a saddle stitch is a great place to start. Before we jump into the next bindings, I wanted to quickly show you how I finish off these books in case you make the same thing. You might notice the pages extend past the covers, and if you want everything to be flush, just use a ruler and a craft knife or a blade and a cutting mat and trim off any excess pages that go beyond it to make everything all the same width. I trimmed off about 1/4 of an inch of the paper, but this may vary, and just keep in mind this is a handmade book and it doesn't have to be perfect, so don't worry if a couple pages stick out a little past that. Alright, now let's get into some other one-section bookbinding methods. If you can do a saddle stitch, you can definitely handle a dash binding. This time I'm going to start at the end of the spine and still leaving a little tail of thread on the inside of the book. Go through to the next hole, and when you reach the inside, you can use the 2 pieces of thread to tie a knot. Return the needle back to the outside, and you can see you've made a dash of thread, and that's where the name of the binding comes from. You can also do different variations of dashes. Here I'm going to return the needle back to the previous hole so I can make a, I guess you would call it a double dash. And to make this symmetrical, I'm going to repeat that same pattern on the next half of my binding. And I wanted to include this so you can see you can mix it up. You don't have to just stick to a bunch of dashes. You can add a triple dash if you want to. When you reach the end, you can tie it off in a knot on the inside. You can see it's definitely similar to the previous binding. It's almost like a segmented saddle stitch. Next, let's try a laced dash. Starting from one side and leaving a tail of thread on the inside, I'm going to leave one hole open for the lace part, so I'm going to skip to the 3rd hole, return the needle back to the inside. From there, I'm making a dash stitch all the way to the remaining 3 holes on the other side. Just like the other end, leaving this second to last hole for the lace part, pulling the thread all the way to the last and returning the needle back to the inside. Now for the laced part, returning the needle back to the outside through that hole that I left, pulling it above the thread and then going back below through the next dash, and weaving it back up on the next dash, and then down through the next one on that remaining hole that I left. So you're lacing the thread through the dashes, making sort of a wave pattern on your binding. And tie off the thread in a knot. If you want to exaggerate that lace portion a bit more and make it more wavy, you can adjust your binding holes. It could also be fun to make that lace portion a different color of thread so it stands out a bit more among those dashes. Now let's try a dot dash. Starting from one end and leaving that tail of thread on the inside, pull the thread all the way to the last hole on the other end of the spine, making one long line of thread. Pull the needle back out through the next hole underneath that long line of thread, and return that needle back through the same hole, this time on top of the thread. So you can see it's making a little dot. If you want to make that dot a little bit more noticeable, you can wrap around one more time on that long piece of thread and return the needle back in, which is essentially making a knot. I did that on every other dot so you can see the difference in size. Whichever size dot you prefer, you can continue doing that until you reach the end of your binding. and tie off the thread in a knot on the inside. I like the tactile nature of this binding, and it could be fun to add some beads on where the dots are, or make the dots a different color of thread if you want to mix it up. Now let's make what is called a bow tie. I'm following the same pattern as my dash binding, only this will be slightly different. Starting from one end, I'm making a dash stitch, then skipping one of the binding holes, which will be the middle of my bow tie. And to make this symmetrical, repeating that pattern on the other half of my binding. Now from the inside, I can see where to return the needle back out to make the center of the bow ties. And just like the dot dash, I'm going to go over around that piece of thread and return the needle back to the inside. And again, it's up to you how many times you want to go around that thread to make a larger dot. And repeating that on the next bow tie. Tie the thread off in a knot on the inside, trim off the excess, and here is my variation of a bow tie stitch. Just like the other ones, you can definitely adjust the binding holes and the colors of thread to make different variations of this stitch. Now for something a little more complex, let's try the twist. Starting from one end, leaving a tail of thread on the inside, returning through the next hole, you're going to come back out the first one, and making sure the thread is coming out underneath the first dash. Return through the next hole on the inside, and at this point you can tie a knot on the end. Now return the needle back through that previous hole, still keeping the thread underneath the previous thread, and return the needle back through the next hole. Go back through the previous hole, keeping it underneath the previous thread again, and return through the next hole. Keep doing that stitching pattern until you reach the last hole. To complete the twist on the end, you can pull the needle through the second to last hole and then return it through the very last one, while still keeping all your new stitches underneath the previous stitches. And tie it off in a knot on the inside. You can see the twisting pattern if you look up close, and it might be more visible if you use a lighter or thicker thread. But it is a way to turn your single piece of thread into a thicker binding with an elegant twisting stitch. Now for something similar in complexity, let's try the hitch. Just like the twist, you're going to start with a single dash, leaving a tail of thread on the inside, and return the needle back through the first hole. This time you're going to make sure all the new thread is above the previous stitches. Return through the next hole, and at this point you can tie off the knot on the inside. Return the needle back through the previous hole, again keeping the new thread above all the previous stitches. Then you're going to loop it underneath the previous two threads, pulling the needle back around, making it hitch around those threads. Return through the next hole, and back out through the previous, making sure you come out above all the thread and then loop it around the previous two threads, creating that hitch. Keep in mind while you bind, you don't have to pull the thread so tight, otherwise if you do, you might lose that looping spiral effect on the stitch. Return the needle back through to the inside and repeat that same pattern of stitching, always pulling the needle above the previous thread, looping it around underneath the previous two, creating that hitch, and then return the needle back through the next hole. When you reach the end, simply create that same stitching pattern you did, go back into the last hole, and tie it off in a knot. This is sort of like a chain stitch, but I like how the thread hitches around the previous thread, making more texture on the binding. Since I already made a chain stitch tutorial, I won't recreate it in this video. I'll link it here. You can also check it out in the description. But since I have one more book to bind, I thought I'd give you a chain stitch variation, one that I'm calling a chain dash. Honestly, I don't know if this binding already exists. If it does, let me know the name of it in the comments. It's a variation I came up with that combines a dash stitch and a chain stitch. Start by making a dash stitch just like we did earlier on in this video, but this time it's all single dashes. When you reach the end, return the needle back through the third to last hole. Loop underneath that last dash, and return back through, making a chain stitch. Repeat that through the remaining areas that don't have a stitch, working your way back to the beginning. You can also keep the tension light when you're making the chain stitches and adjust them as you go along. I think the pattern looks nice when they are more open. When you reach the last chain stitch, tie it off in a knot on the inside. I think this would make a great binding if you're doing something nature related in your book. It reminds me of a vine or a branch of leaves. I highly recommend experimenting with different combinations of these stitches to make your own unique variation. You can try different binding hole measurements or also different thread colors. Let me know which of these stitching variations is your favorite, and if you try these out for yourself, I would love to see your project pictures, so share those with me on my social links and add a hashtag #CLemon. If you made it this far into the video, thanks for sticking around. Now that I've covered the 1-section binding methods, I do plan on moving to the 2-section and 3-section and hopefully making more complex bookbinding stitches and sharing them with you guys. If you don't want to miss any of those, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit the bell right next to it so you can be the first to get notified every time I post a new video. Also, if there's a specific binding method that you want to see on this channel, leave it in the comments below. You can also support more bookbinding videos through my Patreon and YouTube memberships. I will put those links down below as well. If you want to jump into more book projects and try out more binding methods, I will put a couple playlists right here. I continue to add to them as I make more book-related videos, so save them if you need to. All of those links will be down below, and I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!